It is November 4th, 1943, and the Atlantic convoy HX.264 cuts through heavy seas some 800 kilometers west of Ireland. The night is moonless, the water gray-black and violent, and amongst the 43 merchant vessels steaming in formation, the men know they are being hunted. A British escort destroyer, HMS Sharpshooter, cuts through the water at the convoy's flank, her bridge awash with spray, her Aztec operator hunched over a glowing screen below deck. What they are about to experience will change the entire character of the Battle of the Atlantic. Beneath the convoy, a German Type 7C U-boat, the U-264, maintains station at a distance. Her captain has waited patiently. He has done this before, stalked these plodding merchant ships across the gray expanse, chosen his moment, and struck. But today, he does not know that his torpedoes carry something new, something that none of his superiors in Berlin fully understand. As the attack begins, as the first acoustic homing torpedo leaves the tube and races through the water with one singular purpose, the British escort will experience a horror they have never encountered before. The weapon is not aiming for the merchant vessels. It is hunting the warship itself. This is the moment when a quiet revolution began, not in the great design offices of Southampton or the sprawling laboratories of Teddington, though both would later claim their share of credit, but in the desperate chaos of a North Atlantic winter night, when British naval officers discovered that German submarines had begun a new form of warfare. The Germans had weaponized sound itself, but in their attempt to turn the tide of the U-boat war, the British would stumble upon a solution that emerged not from grand strategy, but from hasty improvisation and systematic trial. Within months, they had created something extraordinary, a way to turn the hunter's own weapon against them, using nothing more than noise, metal, and an understanding of how sound travels through salt water. This is the story of how an accidental discovery led to the most effective innovation in anti-submarine defense, a discovery that came not from a moment of genius, but from the discipline of experimentation, the willingness to think laterally, and the British gift for practical improvisation under pressure. The consequences would be profound, stretching far beyond the Atlantic convoys and into the very tactics that would define naval warfare for the remainder of the 20th century. By 1943, the United Kingdom had already endured nearly 4 years of submarine warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached a crescendo of ferocity. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, had sunk more than 400 merchant vessels in the previous 18 months alone, and the rate of loss was accelerating. British shipbuilding could not keep pace. Grain from Canada did not arrive. Oil from the Middle East was not reaching port. The war, it seemed plausible, could be lost not on land or in the air, but beneath the surface of the ocean. The Royal Navy had spent the previous 3 years developing and refining its anti-submarine arsenal. The Aztec system, a revolutionary device that used sound waves to detect submarines below the surface, had been operational since the outbreak of war. The first escort vessels equipped with Aztec had shown considerable promise. The tactics were evolving too: hedgehog mortars that fired charges ahead of moving vessels, depth charges with new patterns of deployment, and increasingly intensive training for escort crews. Yet the U-boats continued to sink ships at a rate that threatened the very survival of Britain. The fundamental problem was simple to state but devilishly complex to solve. The escort vessels and the submarines engaged in a constant competition of technological development. When the British introduced a new tactic, the Germans observed, analyzed, and adapted. When British depth charge patterns changed, German submarine captains modified their responses. The convoy system itself, which should have provided safety in numbers, had become a liability. A U-boat captain could see the massed ships from considerable distance and maintain a position ahead of them, waiting for the ideal moment to attack. The escorts, with their limited speed and endurance, struggled to hunt the submarines effectively. What made matters worse was the growing suspicion among senior naval officers that the Germans possessed technical capabilities that seemed to exceed what intelligence reports suggested. Escorts were being damaged or sunk by what appeared to be deliberate, aimed attacks, rather than the indiscriminate salvos that U-boat captains had employed previously. The pattern was troubling. The Germans seemed impossibly to be striking at the warships protecting the convoys rather than the merchant vessels themselves. The accounts from survivors were fragmentary and often contradictory. Some reported hearing strange noises in the water just before the explosions. Others spoke of a whistling sound, unlike anything they had encountered before. What was certain was that the Royal Navy was facing an opponent who had found a means to strike back against their own escort vessels. By mid-November 1943, the British Admiralty had obtained definitive proof of what they had begun to suspect. A German U-boat, the U-544, was captured intact by the minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter and the trawler HMS Sharpshoe after being rammed off the north coast of Ireland. Below decks in the torpedo compartments, naval intelligence officers found something that changed everything: a new type of torpedo, the Gnat, known to the Germans as the Zaunkönig, or acoustic homing torpedo. Unlike every other torpedo that had been fired in anger throughout the war, this weapon did not require aiming. It did not rely upon the captain's judgment of the target's course and speed. Instead, it carried inside its casing a remarkable piece of engineering: an acoustic homing head, a device that could listen to the vibrations produced by a ship's propellers and follow them to their source. The acoustic homing head was, in essence, a mechanical ear. It consisted of a series of hydrophones, devices not dissimilar to microphone capsules, arranged in a particular configuration around the torpedo's nose. These hydrophones detected the low-frequency vibrations, typically between 130 Hz, that were produced when a ship's propeller churned through salt water. The sound of a propeller rotating at perhaps 200 revolutions per minute creates a distinctive acoustic signature, a fingerprint of noise that travels through seawater at a speed of roughly 1,500 meters per second. The acoustic head compared the signals arriving at each hydrophone in rapid succession. If the sound was louder in the forward hydrophones, the torpedo would adjust its rudder slightly to port. If it was louder to starboard, the fins would move the opposite way. The effect was a weapon that would hunt, unerringly, for the source of the noise. The implications were immediately apparent to the British naval officers examining the torpedo. A U-boat captain could fire one of these weapons from a position well outside the range of visual detection. He did not need to calculate angles and speeds. He did not need to present his vessel to the greatest danger by adopting a firing position parallel to his target. He could attack from astern, from any angle, and the torpedo would pursue the escort vessel as a fox pursues a rabbit. In the first action, when such a torpedo was used, HMS Sharpshooter had been struck and damaged. The second attack had sunk HMS Starling, a minesweeper, with the loss of 24 men. The weapon was devastatingly effective. What the Germans did not realize, however, was that they had given the British Admiralty the solution to the problem they had created. If acoustic homing torpedoes hunted ships by listening to their propeller noise, then the answer was elegantly simple: make more noise somewhere else. Within days, the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare establishment at Portland began developing a countermeasure. The result was the Foxer, a device that would be towed behind escort vessels on a cable. The Foxer was not a complex piece of machinery. It was, in its essence, nothing more than a metal pipe, generally about 18 meters in length, that was towed at a distance from the ship. Inside this pipe, small explosive charges could be detonated in a rapid sequence, creating a cacophony of acoustic disturbance in the water. The charges, often cartridges no larger than a man's thumb, were triggered by a simple mechanical timer that fired them at rapid intervals, perhaps one explosion every few seconds. The effect was a wall of noise in the water directly along the path of the Foxer, a decoy so compelling that an acoustic homing torpedo would pursue the Foxer rather than the ship itself. The manufacturing process was straightforward enough that production could begin almost immediately. Steel pipes were obtained from naval stores. Explosive charges were already in production for other purposes. The mechanical firing mechanism was designed to be so simple that it could be operated by junior ratings with minimal training. By December 1943, the first Foxers were being fitted to escort vessels operating in the Atlantic. The device was cheap, reliable, and remarkably effective. Testing showed that a properly deployed Foxer could divert more than 80% of acoustic homing torpedo attacks. The British had not invented a more sophisticated countermeasure. They had instead embraced simplicity and discovered that sometimes the best solution to a problem of acoustic deception is noise itself. The first operational deployment of the Foxer occurred in December 1943, aboard the minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter, the very vessel that had been attacked by the Gnat torpedo several weeks earlier. The device was towed on a cable behind the ship, and the escorts in the Atlantic convoys began to employ them in combination with traditional anti-submarine tactics. The effect was immediate and profound. The rate of attacks by acoustic homing torpedoes fell sharply. U-boat captains reported that their prized new weapons were becoming unreliable, that their acoustic heads were somehow being deceived by the target ships themselves. The operation of the Foxer in combat was a matter of simple procedure. As a convoy came under attack by U-boats, particularly when acoustic homing torpedoes were suspected, the escort vessels would deploy their Foxers. The device would be streamed on a cable held at a particular distance from the stern of the ship, and the mechanical firing system would be activated. The result was a wake of acoustic disturbance trailing behind each escorted vessel. When a Gnat torpedo was fired, it would enter the water and immediately begin its search for propeller noise. In the presence of the Foxer, it would typically lock onto the decoy and pursue it to detonation, expending its warhead harmlessly. Several specific attacks illustrate the effectiveness of the system. In January 1944, convoy Owens.29 came under sustained attack by a wolf pack of 7 U-boats, several of which were equipped with acoustic homing torpedoes. The escort vessels, all carrying Foxers, reported that they had observed torpedo wakes passing their positions and streaming directly toward the decoys. The merchant vessels in the convoy sustained minimal casualties. By contrast, U-boat losses in the engagement were significant, with one vessel, the U-592, sunk by Hedgehog counterattack. The psychological impact on German U-boat captains was substantial. The weapon that they had believed would prove revolutionary had been largely neutralized within weeks. The British records of the Foxer deployments, though occasionally vague regarding classified details, suggest that by mid-1944, the device had been fitted to the majority of escort vessels operating in the Atlantic. The impact on convoy losses was measurable. In the first half of 1944, merchant ship losses to U-boat attack fell by nearly 70% compared to the same period in 1943. The exact number of vessels that the Foxer saved is impossible to determine with precision, but estimates suggest that several hundred ships that might otherwise have been sunk were preserved. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate your support. The Foxer represented a distinctly British approach to the problem of acoustic warfare. The Germans, once they understood what had happened, attempted their own countermeasures. The most significant was a modification to the acoustic homing head itself, creating what they termed the T5 Gnat type, which incorporated frequency-selective components designed to discriminate between genuine propeller noise and the artificial disturbance created by a Foxer. However, these modifications were never implemented in sufficient numbers to significantly alter the tactical situation. German U-boat production in 1944 and 1945 was increasingly constrained by Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities and the depletion of trained crews. The Americans, who had initially relied on passive listening devices and conventional depth-charge tactics, eventually adopted the Foxer concept with modifications suited to their own escort vessel designs. The American version, designated the Grayling Noisemaker, operated on similar principles but employed different mechanical components. The Americans also experimented with towed apparatus of greater sophistication, some incorporating magnetic properties alongside acoustic deception. However, the fundamental simplicity of the British design proved superior in operational conditions. The Foxer was cheaper to manufacture, easier to maintain, and required less training to operate effectively. Comparison with other anti-submarine innovations of the period reveals the Foxer's particular advantages. The Hedgehog ahead throwing mortar, deployed by British escort vessels from 1942 onwards, offered offensive capability, a way to attack submarines that were detected ahead of a moving vessel. The Hedgehog required skilled operators and could only be effective if the target's position was known with reasonable accuracy. The Aztec system provided detection capability but could be evaded if the submarine captain exercised caution and patience. The Foxer, by contrast, offered defense. It did not kill submarines or necessarily force them to disengage. What it did accomplish was to render the U-boat's most advanced weapon ineffective. In purely mathematical terms, it reduced the probability of a convoy being struck by more than 80%. No other single innovation in the Atlantic War achieved a comparable level of protective effect. The Germans, it should be noted, never developed an effective counter to the Foxer before the war's end. Proposed modifications to the acoustic homing head remained on drawing boards. The German Navy, consumed by the increasing demands of homeland defense against Allied bombing and challenged by the strategic strangulation of U-boat production, lacked the resources to implement major design changes to their torpedo systems. The impact of the Foxer extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Atlantic. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare, the first large-scale deployment of a decoy system designed to defeat guided weapons. Earlier in the war, the British had experimented with passive decoys for aircraft, strips of metallic foil designed to confuse radar, but the Foxer was the first operational decoy system deployed against a weapon with a genuinely intelligent guidance mechanism. The historical assessment of the Foxer's effectiveness must acknowledge that the device did not, by itself, win the Battle of the Atlantic. The underlying strategic factors remained overwhelming. The Allies' growing convoy escort strength, the development of longer-range aircraft for anti-submarine patrol, the application of strategic bombing against German U-boat production facilities, and the losses inflicted upon experienced U-boat crews all contributed to the eventual collapse of the U-boat threat. However, the Foxer provided a crucial tactical response at a moment when the Germans appeared to have discovered a weapon that might have significantly extended the U-boat campaign. The psychological effect, though difficult to quantify, was significant. German U-boat captains, who had been trained to believe that the Gnat torpedo represented a revolutionary advantage, found that advantage largely negated within weeks. Morale, already damaged by increasing losses, suffered further. The knowledge that even their most advanced weapons were being countered by relatively simple British improvisation was demoralizing. German naval officers expressed frustration at their inability to respond effectively. The surviving examples of Foxer decoys can be seen today in several maritime museums, most notably the Imperial War Museum's collection. The device itself appears deceptively simple: a length of pipe, a mechanical timer, and basic electrical connections. To an observer unfamiliar with the context, it might appear crude or even primitive. Yet this simplicity was its strength. The Foxer represents a principle of wartime innovation that would be revisited repeatedly. Sometimes the answer to a sophisticated problem is not a more sophisticated solution, but a more elegant one. Return, if you will, to the North Atlantic on that November night in 1943, when HMS Sharpshooter lay in the water, damaged but not sunk, and her crew were still trying to comprehend what had struck them. Within hours, intelligence officers would be examining the captured U-boat and its revolutionary torpedoes. Within days, Portland's scientists would be sketching designs for countermeasures. Within weeks, the Foxer would be in production. Within months, it would be saving ships and lives across the entire Atlantic convoy system. The remarkable aspect of this story is not that the British developed an answer to the German acoustic homing torpedo. The remarkable aspect is how quickly they did it and how comprehensively. While the Germans were congratulating themselves on a technological breakthrough, the British were already working to neutralize it. While German planners were calculating how the Gnat would extend the U-boat war, British improvisation was rendering the calculation obsolete. The Foxer was, in many ways, the perfect expression of a particular kind of British ingenuity under pressure. It was not the result of years of theoretical research. It was not the product of unlimited resources or grand strategic vision. It was instead the consequence of clear-eyed analysis, practical understanding of acoustics and the behavior of submarine weapons, and the will to act with speed and pragmatism. The British looked at what the Germans had created and did not attempt to outthink them. They instead attempted to out-improvise them, and in that competition they prevailed decisively. The legacy of the Foxer extended far beyond the Second World War. The principle of acoustic decoys would be refined and developed in the decades to come. Modern naval vessels, both military and civilian, carry sophisticated systems descended from the Foxer's basic concept. The Cold War navies of the Soviet Union and the United States would develop these ideas into complex arrays of countermeasures designed to confuse and deceive guided weapons. The concept of noise as a defense, of drowning out a weapon's guidance system with acoustic interference, would become foundational to modern naval tactics. Yet none of that would have occurred without that moment in December 1943, when a simple idea that you could defend a ship by making noise in the water was tested, proven effective, and rapidly deployed. What began as a hasty experiment, a response to an unexpected threat, became one of the most consequential innovations in naval warfare. The British had not defeated the Gnat torpedo through superior complexity or elaborate design. They had defeated it through clarity of thought and practical simplicity. The Foxer remains, more than 80 years later, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful solutions are the most obvious ones, if you have the wisdom and the courage to see them.